At 62 years old, Shaq believed he had already experienced every kind of victory and loss life could bring, until a simple DNA test from his daughter Emily Carter uncovered a hidden truth that shattered everything he knew about his family. In a matter of hours, the man who had spent decades raising his children with unconditional love was forced to question his entire past, discovering a son he never knew existed, and facing the heartbreaking possibility that the children he had raised might not share his blood. But beyond the pain, betrayal, and unanswered questions, Shaq would uncover something far more powerful than DNA, a story of lost years, unexpected reunions, and a father's love strong enough to bring a broken family back together. At 62 years old, Shaq believed he had already lived through every kind of moment life could offer. He had experienced the highest level of success an athlete could dream of, from standing on championship stages to hearing millions of people celebrate his name. The world knew him as a basketball legend, a businessman, and a man who had built an incredible life after leaving the court. But behind all of that fame, Shaq was something much more important to him. He was a father who had spent decades trying to give his children the love, guidance, and support he wished every child could have. For Shaq, the greatest victories in life were never the trophies or the records. They were the small moments that happened away from the cameras. They were the mornings when he watched his children get ready for school, the nights when he stayed up listening to their worries, and the times when he saw them overcome challenges that made them stronger. Those moments were the ones he carried in his heart, because they reminded him that his biggest responsibility was not being a celebrity, but being someone his children could always count on. Over the years, Shaq watched his children grow into adults with dreams, personalities, and lives of their own. He remembered the days when they were young and looked at him like he could solve any problem in the world. He remembered teaching them lessons about confidence, hard work, and kindness. He remembered being there during important moments, both the happy ones and the painful ones. To Shaq, those memories were proof that he had done something meaningful with his life. But as time passed, there were moments when Shaq felt something he could not fully explain. It was not a feeling of sadness, because he was grateful for everything he had. It was not regret, because he knew he had given his best to the people he loved. It was simply a quiet feeling that there might still be a part of his life story he had not discovered yet. A missing piece that he could not see but somehow felt was there. Shaq never talked much about that feeling because, from the outside, it seemed like he had everything. He had a beautiful family, a successful career, and a life that millions of people admired. But sometimes, when the day ended and the noise of the world disappeared, he would look back at his journey and wonder if there were still chapters of his story waiting to be revealed. He believed he knew his family completely. He believed he knew every important person who had shaped his life. He believed the story of his past was already written. After everything he had experienced, he thought the biggest surprises were behind him, and that the future would simply be about enjoying more time with his children and watching the next generation grow. Then came his birthday. It was supposed to be a normal celebration, filled with laughter, memories, and time together as a family. For Shaq, those were always the moments he valued most. No matter how famous he became, he never lost appreciation for simple things, sitting with his children, sharing stories, and feeling the connection that only family could bring. That day, his daughter Emily Carter approached him with a small gift. It was not something expensive or something designed to impress anyone. It was a simple package, but it carried something much more meaningful because it came from his daughter. Emily wanted to give her father an experience they could share together, something that would help them learn more about their family history. Inside the package was a DNA test kit. To Emily, it was just a fun idea. She imagined the two of them looking through the results together, discovering where their ancestors came from, and laughing about unexpected details they might find. She saw it as another memory she could create with the father she loved. There was no reason to believe it would become anything more than that. When Shaq opened the gift, he smiled. He loved that Emily had thought of something they could do together. More than anything, He appreciated the effort behind it. His daughter was not trying to give him something valuable in a financial sense. She was giving him time, curiosity, and a chance to connect with her in a different way. Without hesitation, Shaq agreed to take the test. At that moment, nobody in the family saw anything unusual. Nobody felt worried. Nobody imagined that this simple decision would uncover a truth that had been hidden for decades. It was just a father accepting a thoughtful gift from his daughter, believing it would become another happy memory they could look back on years later. But life often changes in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes the smallest moments become the ones that completely transform everything we thought we knew. A simple decision made in a quiet moment can open a door to the past and reveal things we never expected to find. Shaq sent the DNA sample away and continued living his normal life. He spent time with his children, enjoyed peaceful days, and continued believing that his family's story was complete. He had no idea that somewhere, far away, a result was being prepared that would challenge everything he believed about his own life. Because the test was not just going to reveal where his ancestors came from. It was going to reveal a secret that would make him question his past, break his heart, and introduce him to a son he never knew existed. And this small gift from Emily Carter would become the beginning of the most emotional journey Shaq had ever faced. Before the DNA test changed everything, Shaq believed he already knew the most important story of his life, the story of his family. After decades of success, fame, and challenges, the one thing he felt certain about was the bond he shared with his children. To Shaq, family was never about having a perfect life or avoiding every problem. It was about the moments people shared together, the memories they created, and the love that remained even during difficult times. When Shaq looked at Emily Carter, Jason Carter, and Ethan Carter, he did not just see his children. He saw years of his life reflected back at him. He saw the little moments that shaped him into the man he had become. He remembered carrying them when they were young, watching their personalities grow, and learning that being a father meant much more than simply providing for them. It meant showing up, listening, protecting them, and making sure they always knew they were loved. Shaq often thought about how quickly those years had passed. There was a time when his children were small and looked to him for every answer. They believed their father could fix anything. They believed he was the strongest person in the world. But as they grew older, Shaq realized that his role had changed. He was no longer just the person who protected them from the world. He became the person they came to for advice, support, and encouragement when life became difficult. Some of his favorite memories came from moments that had nothing to do with fame or success. They came from ordinary days that meant everything to him. It was sitting at home after a long day, listening to his children talk about their dreams. It was watching them overcome challenges. It was seeing their faces light up when they accomplished something they had worked hard for. Those were the moments that reminded Shaq that his greatest achievement was never winning championships. It was building a family that loved and trusted him. With Jason and Ethan, basketball became one of the strongest connections between them. Shaq understood the pressure that came with the sport because he had experienced it himself. He knew what it felt like to fail, to face criticism, and to wonder if you were good enough. So when his sons struggled, he never wanted them to believe that one mistake defined them. He remembered the times when they walked off the court disappointed after a bad game. Instead of only talking about what went wrong, Shaq focused on teaching them something bigger. He wanted them to understand that life was not about being perfect. Everyone loses. Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing was learning, growing, and having the courage to try again. For Emily, Shaq saw a different kind of strength. He watched his daughter grow into someone who cared deeply about the people around her. She was thoughtful, compassionate, and always wanted to keep the family connected. Over the years, she became someone Shaq could talk to not only as a father, but also as a friend. Their relationship was built on trust, and he was proud of the woman she had become. Looking back, Shaq believed those years had created something unbreakable. He knew families could face disagreements and difficult moments, but he believed the love between parents and children could survive anything. Blood, history, and shared experiences were all part of a family, But what truly mattered was the connection built through years of love and sacrifice. That belief became the foundation of everything Shaq understood about being a father. He never measured his relationship with his children by anything that could be written on paper. He measured it by the memories they shared. He measured it by the times they needed him, and he was there. He measured it by the trust in their eyes when they looked at him. To Shaq, there was no question about where his children belonged in his life. Emily, Jason, and Ethan were his family. They were the people who gave meaning to everything he had achieved. They were the reason behind many of the choices he made. They were the part of his life he was most proud of. That was why he never imagined a simple DNA test could change the way he looked at his own story. He never imagined that a few numbers on a report could bring questions that reached back decades. He never imagined that something created as a fun family activity could uncover secrets that would challenge the foundation he believed was permanent. Because in Shaq's heart, family was not something that could be erased by a test result. Family was built through thousands of moments that happened over years. It was built through love, patience, forgiveness, and everything people experienced together. But sometimes life reveals truths that force people to look at their past in a completely different way. And while Shaq continued living each day believing his family story was already complete, the answer he was waiting for was getting closer. The DNA test that began as a simple birthday gift was about to arrive with information that would shake everything he believed about his family. Soon, Shaq would discover that the story he thought he knew was only part of the truth. For several weeks after sending the DNA sample, Shaq completely forgot about the test. Life continued normally, and nothing seemed different. He was still spending time with his family, still enjoying the quiet moments that came after years of hard work, and still believing that the biggest chapters of his life had already been written. To him, the DNA test was nothing more than a simple gift from Emily, a small experience they could share together and a chance to learn a little more about where their family came from. He never thought it could reveal anything that would change the way he saw his own life. Shaq had no reason to be worried. He was not looking for answers about his family because he believed he already had them. He knew the people who had been beside him for decades. He knew the children he had raised, the memories they created, and the love they shared. In his mind, this was just another family moment, something that would bring curiosity and maybe a few interesting stories. Then, one quiet morning, everything changed. Shaq opened his email and noticed a message from the DNA company. At first, he looked at it without any concern. He expected to see information about his heritage, maybe details about his ancestors, or places connected to his family history. He thought he would read through the results, smile at whatever he discovered, and continue with his day. But as he opened the report, he immediately felt that something was different. The information on the screen did not look like the simple family history report he expected. There were connections he did not recognize, and names that meant nothing to him. Shaq slowly went through the results, trying to understand what he was seeing. He wondered if there had been some kind of mistake, because the information in front of him did not match the story he had known his entire life. Then he saw a name that stopped him: Daniel Brooks. It was a name he had never heard before. There were no memories attached to it, no family stories, no childhood moments, no explanation for why this person appeared in his DNA results. But then Shaq saw the relationship listed next to the name: biological son. For a moment, Shaq could not move. He stared at the screen, reading the words again and again, hoping that somehow he had misunderstood them. But the result remained unchanged. This was not a distant relative. This was not a mistake in the system. This was a person who shared his blood, a son who had existed for decades without Shaq ever knowing he was there. The feeling that came over him was impossible to describe. Shaq had spent his entire life believing that being a father was his greatest responsibility. He had always tried to be present for his children, to guide them, support them, and protect them through every stage of life. He knew the importance of showing up because he understood that childhood moments only happen once. But now he was facing a truth that broke his heart. There was another child, another son, and there was an entire lifetime he had missed. Shaq began thinking about all the moments he never experienced with Daniel. He thought about the first time Daniel learned to walk, the first day he went to school, the moments when he struggled and needed someone to encourage him, and the times when he looked around and wondered who his father was. Those were moments Shaq could never get back. The pain was not because he did not love Daniel. The pain came from knowing that he would have loved him if he had known. He would have been there. He would have supported him. He would have celebrated his victories and helped him through his hardest days. But he never had the chance, and that was the hardest truth to accept. For the first time in many years, Shaq felt something he rarely experienced, a feeling of helplessness. The man who had faced enormous pressure on basketball courts, who had overcome criticism and challenges throughout his career, suddenly found himself facing a situation where strength and success could not fix the problem. He could not go back in time. He could not rewrite Daniel's childhood. He could not recover the years that had already passed. All he could do was accept the truth and decide what he would do next. Shaq looked at the name Daniel Brooks and realized this was not just a DNA result. This was a person, a real person who had his own dreams, his own memories, and his own story. A person who had lived 40 years without knowing that somewhere in the world, his biological father was Shaq. The discovery changed the way Shaq looked at his own past. The memories he once thought were complete suddenly felt like they were missing an important piece. He began wondering how many birthdays Daniel had spent without him, how many difficult moments Daniel had faced alone, and how different his life might have been if they had known about each other sooner. But beneath the pain was something else: hope. Because even though Shaq could not change the years they lost, he still had the chance to change the years ahead. He knew the first step would not be easy. He did not know how Daniel would react. He did not know if Daniel would be angry, confused, or unwilling to accept him. Shaq understood that showing up decades late did not erase the pain of being absent. But he also knew one thing: a father who truly loves his child does not run away when the truth becomes difficult. And for Shaq, the search for Daniel Brooks was about to become more than finding a son he never knew existed. It was about finding a missing part of his own heart. Because the DNA test that was supposed to reveal his family history had uncovered something much deeper. It had revealed a story that had been waiting for decades to finally be told. After discovering Daniel Brooks was his biological son, Shaq thought he had already experienced the most painful surprise of his life. He believed nothing could hurt more than learning that an entire lifetime with his son had passed without him knowing. He was still trying to understand that reality, still trying to accept the emotions that came with finding a child he never had the chance to raise. But as he continued looking deeper into the DNA results, he discovered something that would break his heart in an entirely different way. The information connected to Daniel was not the only thing that caught his attention. As Shaq reviewed the results more carefully, he noticed something that made him stop. The same test that revealed Daniel's existence also raised questions about his relationship with Jason and Ethan. At first, Shaq refused to believe what he was seeing. He told himself there had to be an explanation. There had to be some kind of mistake, because the idea in front of him was impossible to accept. Jason and Ethan, the two sons he had spent years loving, teaching, and protecting, appeared to have no biological connection to him. For a moment, Shaq felt like the ground beneath him had disappeared. The pain was different from what he felt when he learned about Daniel. With Daniel, the heartbreak came from losing years he never had. But with Jason and Ethan, the pain came from questioning years he thought he understood completely. He thought about every memory they shared, every conversation, every moment when they called him their father. Suddenly, he was forced to face a question he never believed he would ask. Was everything he knew about his family different from what he believed? Shaq looked back at old photos of Jason and Ethan. He saw their childhood smiles, their celebrations, and the countless moments they had shared together. He remembered teaching them lessons, comforting them when they were disappointed, and watching them grow into the men they became. Those memories were real. The love was real. But now he was struggling with a truth that made him question where those connections came from. The hardest part was knowing that DNA could answer a biological question, but it could not measure the love between a father and his children. Still, Shaq needed answers. He could not move forward without understanding how this happened. With a heavy heart, Shaq reached out to Lauren Carter, the mother of Jason and Ethan. It was a conversation he never wanted to have, but one he knew could no longer be avoided. For years, they had shared the responsibility of raising their children. They had built memories together, faced challenges together, and created a family that Shaq believed was based on honesty. Now he needed to know the truth. When Lauren answered the call, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. Shaq was not calling to discuss everyday family matters. There was a seriousness in his voice that made her realize this conversation would change everything. Shaq explained what the DNA results showed. He told her about Daniel. He told her about the unexpected discovery. And then he asked the question that had been weighing on his heart since he saw the results. He needed to know if Jason and Ethan were truly his sons. The silence that followed felt heavier than any answer. For Lauren, the moment she had spent years trying to avoid had finally arrived. The secrets, fears, and choices from decades earlier could no longer stay hidden. She knew that whatever happened next, there was no way to undo the pain that the truth would bring. Lauren finally revealed that there were things from their past that Shaq never knew. Decisions made during a complicated time in their relationship. Moments of fear and confusion. Mistakes that she had carried quietly for years because she was afraid of what would happen if the truth came out. For Shaq, hearing those words was devastating. He was not only dealing with the shock of the information, he was dealing with the emotions behind it. He felt hurt because the truth had been hidden from him. He felt confused because the family story he believed for so long suddenly looked different. He felt sadness because he wondered how many people had known something that he did not. But the strongest feeling was grief. Shaq was grieving the version of his life he thought was real. He was grieving the certainty he once had. He was grieving the idea that he understood every part of his journey as a father. Yet, even in that painful moment, one thought kept returning to him. Jason and Ethan were still the same children he had loved all their lives. Nothing about a DNA result could erase the mornings he spent with them. Nothing could erase the lessons he taught them. Nothing could erase the moments when they needed him and he was there. But knowing that did not make the pain disappear. Shaq was trapped between two powerful emotions. One side of him felt betrayed by the truth that had been hidden for so long. Another side of him could not stop loving the children who had always been his family. He wondered how a person could hold both feelings at the same time. How could someone feel heartbreak and love together? How could the truth hurt so deeply while the bond remained so strong? For the first time in his life, Shaq faced a challenge that could not be solved with determination, hard work, or strength. This was not a game where he could fight until the final whistle. This was a moment where he had to accept pain, face difficult emotions, and decide what truly defined a family. Because now Shaq had to answer the most difficult question of his life. Was family created by blood, or was family created by all the years of love, sacrifice, and memories that could never be taken away? And as Shaq searched for that answer, he realized that the truth had not only revealed secrets from the past, it had opened the door to the hardest emotional journey he had ever faced. After the truth came out, Shaq found himself living between two worlds. One part of his life was filled with memories he treasured, while another part was filled with questions he never expected to ask. He had spent decades believing he understood his family completely, but now everything felt different. The people he loved were still the same people. The memories were still real. But the meaning behind some of those moments had changed. In the quiet moments when nobody was around, Shaq found himself looking through old photos of Jason and Ethan. He would sit with his phone or hold old family pictures in his hands, staring at moments that once felt simple and certain. He saw their childhood smiles, their first basketball games, family celebrations, and all the memories they had built together over the years. Every picture brought a different emotion. Some memories made him smile because they reminded him of the love they shared. He remembered the pride he felt watching them grow, the happiness he felt when they achieved their goals, and the countless moments when he knew being their father was the greatest gift in his life. But those same memories also carried pain now. Shaq found himself wondering about everything he had missed with Daniel. While he was creating memories with Jason and Ethan, there was another child somewhere in the world who was growing up without knowing him. There was another son who had his own childhood, his own struggles and his own dreams that Shaq never got to see. That thought stayed with him. It was not that Shaq loved Jason and Ethan any less. His love for them had been built over years of shared experiences, and nothing could erase that. But he could not ignore the reality that there was another person connected to him who had lost something too. Daniel had lost a father, and Shaq had lost the chance to be one. For the first time, Shaq understood that time was the one thing nobody could replace. Money could buy opportunities, success could open doors, but no amount of achievement could bring back the birthdays, holidays, school events, and ordinary days that had already passed. Those were moments that were gone forever. The pain became even stronger when Shaq started imagining Daniel's life. He wondered what kind of child Daniel had been. Was he someone who loved sports? Did he have moments when he needed advice from a father? Did he ever wonder why his biological father was not there? Did he ever look at his own life and feel like something was missing? Shaq did not have answers, and that was the hardest part. For years, Shaq had been someone people looked to for confidence and strength. He was the person who encouraged others to keep fighting when life became difficult. But now he was facing a situation where there was no easy solution. He could not fix the past. He could not erase the pain. He could only decide what he would do with the truth he had discovered. And that decision became clear. Shaq was not going to run away. He was not going to ignore Daniel because the situation was complicated. He was not going to pretend the past did not exist. If Daniel was his son, then Daniel deserved the same thing every child deserved, to know that his father cared about him. So Shaq began searching for him. He started learning everything he could about Daniel Brooks. He wanted to know who this person was beyond the DNA result. He wanted to understand his life, his personality, his dreams, and the journey that brought him to this moment. The more Shaq discovered, the more emotional he became. Daniel was not just a name on a report. He was a real person who had built a life without him. He learned that Daniel had grown into someone kind and responsible, someone who had faced his own challenges and still managed to become a person others respected. Instead of feeling anger toward the years they lost, Shaq felt something else growing inside him: pride. Even though he had not been there to guide Daniel, he was proud of the man he had become. But that pride came with sadness, because Shaq knew he had missed the chance to be part of that journey. Still, he refused to let regret stop him. He knew he could not become the father Daniel needed in the past. But maybe, if Daniel was willing, he could become the father Daniel needed in the future. That hope gave him the strength to keep moving forward. Shaq had spent his entire life believing that family was something he protected. Now, he was learning that sometimes family was something you had to find. The DNA test had taken away the certainty he once had. It had forced him to face painful truths about the past. But it had also revealed someone who had been missing from his life for decades. A son he never knew existed. A son he now wanted to know. And as Shaq prepared to meet Daniel for the first time, he understood that this journey was not about changing what happened. It was about showing up for what could still happen. Because some moments in life arrive too late to rewrite the past, but they arrived just in time to change the future. After discovering Daniel Brooks was his biological son, Shaq spent days trying to understand the life of the man he had never known. He had spent years being a father to his children, but now he was facing a painful reality. There was another child who had grown up without his presence, a child who had lived through important moments without the guidance, support, and love that Shaq always wanted to give his children. As Shaq began learning more about Daniel, he realized that Daniel's story was not defined only by the absence of a father. It was also a story about strength, kindness, and the person Daniel had chosen to become, despite the unanswered questions in his life. Daniel Brooks grew up in a world where he did not know the full truth about his own identity. He knew there was a missing piece in his family story, but he never understood what that missing piece was. Like many people who grow up without knowing one of their biological parents, Daniel carried questions that he rarely shared with others. He wondered about where he came from. He wondered who he was connected to. He wondered if there was someone out there who looked like him, shared his personality, or had similar dreams. But instead of allowing those questions to define him, Daniel focused on building his own life. He learned from the people around him, worked hard, and became someone who others could depend on. He was not someone who allowed the things he did not have to control the things he could become. The more Shaq learned about Daniel, the more emotional he became. He discovered that Daniel had grown into a thoughtful and caring man. He was someone who treated people with respect, someone who valued family, and someone who had created a meaningful life despite not having all the answers about his own beginning. That realization was both comforting and painful for Shaq. He was proud of Daniel, but he was also heartbroken, because the more he learned about the man Daniel had become, the more he thought about everything he had missed. Shaq started looking through pictures of Daniel's life. He saw moments that existed without him, birthdays where someone else helped him blow out the candles, school events where Shaq was not sitting in the crowd, achievements that Daniel celebrated without hearing his father say how proud he was. Every picture told a story, but every picture also reminded Shaq that he was not there. He imagined Daniel as a young boy, experiencing life's first moments without knowing the man who was supposed to be part of them. He wondered who held his hand when he was afraid, who encouraged him when he failed, who told him he was capable when he doubted himself. Those were the moments Shaq could never get back, and that was the part that hurt the most. Shaq had not simply missed one important day. He had missed years. He had missed thousands of small moments that seemed ordinary at the time, but became priceless memories later. The jokes between a father and son, the conversations during long drives, the advice given during difficult times, the simple feeling of knowing someone would always be there. Those moments could never be recreated. Shaq understood that no apology could return those years to Daniel. No explanation could replace the childhood memories they never shared. He could not go back and become the father he should have been during those missing decades. All he could do was accept the pain and be honest about it. For the first time, Shaq realized that losing Daniel was not because of one single moment. It was not because he chose to walk away. It was not because he did not care. He lost decades of memories that should have existed, and no matter how much love he had in his heart now, he could never recover the time that had already passed. That truth was difficult to accept, but instead of allowing regret to consume him, Shaq decided to turn that pain into action. He knew he could not change Daniel's past, but he could choose to become part of Daniel's future. He wanted Daniel to know that even though they were strangers for most of their lives, he mattered. He wanted him to know that he was not forgotten. He wanted him to know that his father was ready to listen, learn, and build something new. Because Shaq understood something important. Being a father was not only about being there from the beginning. Sometimes being a father was about having the courage to show up when the truth finally gave you the chance. And now, after a lifetime apart, Shaq was preparing to meet the son he never had the opportunity to raise, a son who grew up without him, a son who had become an incredible man anyway, and a son who was about to discover that the father he never knew was finally coming to find him. For decades, Shaq had imagined many important moments in his life. He had imagined winning championships, achieving success, watching his children grow, and reaching a place where he could finally slow down and appreciate everything he had built. But he never imagined that one of the most emotional moments of his life would come from sitting across from a person he had never met before and realizing that this stranger was his own son. After discovering Daniel Brooks, Shaq knew that finding him was only the first step. The harder part was facing the moment when they would finally meet. He knew that no matter how much love he felt, he could not simply walk into Daniel's life and expect everything to feel normal. They were connected by blood, but they were also two people who had lived completely different lives for decades. Shaq wondered what Daniel would think when he saw him. Would Daniel feel angry? Would he feel hurt? Would he believe that Shaq truly wanted a relationship with him, or would he only see the years that had been lost? These questions stayed in Shaq's mind as he prepared for their first meeting. For Daniel, the moment carried its own emotions. Meeting Shaq meant meeting the person connected to a part of his identity he had never fully understood. The man in front of him was not just a famous athlete known around the world. He was the father he never knew he had. When they finally stood face to face for the first time, there was a moment of silence between them. Neither of them knew exactly what to say. After a lifetime apart, there were too many emotions to fit into a few simple words. They looked at each other, knowing that this single moment represented years of questions, years of uncertainty, and years of a connection that neither of them knew existed. For Shaq, seeing Daniel in front of him made the reality feel even more powerful. The DNA result was no longer just information on a screen. Daniel was a real person, standing in front of him. He could see his son's expressions, hear his voice, and feel the weight of everything they had missed. The emotions were overwhelming because Shaq was not only meeting Daniel for the first time, he was also meeting all the years he had lost. He was meeting the child he never watched grow up. He was meeting the young man he never had the chance to guide. He was meeting the son he had been searching for. As they spent more time together, something unexpected began to happen. Even though they had lived separate lives, Shaq and Daniel started noticing small similarities between them. The way they reacted to certain situations, the way they approached conversations, the way they thought about family and responsibility. Some things could not be explained by a DNA test. They were simply part of who they were. Shaq noticed that Daniel carried many of the same qualities he valued in himself. Daniel was thoughtful, patient, and someone who cared deeply about the people around him. He was not defined by what he had lost. Instead, he had built a life based on kindness and strength. That made Shaq proud. At the same time, Daniel began seeing pieces of himself in Shaq. Beyond the fame and the public image, he saw a man who cared deeply about family. He saw someone who was emotional, honest, and willing to face painful truths instead of avoiding them. The more they talked, the more they realized they were not starting from nothing. They were starting from a connection that had been waiting to be discovered. They talked about their lives, their experiences, and the things that shaped them into who they were. They shared stories about their interests, their dreams, and the moments that had changed them. With every conversation, the distance created by decades began to feel a little smaller. But even in those emotional moments, Shaq understood something important. Meeting Daniel did not erase the past. It did not bring back the birthdays he missed, the childhood memories they never created, or the years they spent apart. Shaq knew there would always be a part of their story that they could never recover. But he also realized something else. A lost past did not mean they had to lose their future. Shaq could not go back and become the father Daniel needed when he was a child. He could not change what happened decades ago, but he could choose what kind of father he wanted to be from that moment forward. He could listen, he could learn, he could show up, and most importantly, he could make sure Daniel never felt forgotten again. For Shaq, this meeting was not about trying to replace the years they lost. It was about creating new memories, one moment at a time. It was about building a relationship that was not based only on what happened in the past, but on the choices they made together moving forward. The first meeting between Shaq and Daniel did not magically fix everything. There were still emotions to process and many conversations they needed to have, but it gave them something they both needed: a beginning. After a lifetime of being strangers, father and son finally had the chance to know each other. And for Shaq, that was the greatest opportunity he could have asked for. Because sometimes life does not give people the chance to rewrite the first chapters of their story, but sometimes, if they are brave enough, it gives them the chance to create a better ending. When the truth about the DNA results became known, Shaq knew that every person in his family would react differently. He had already experienced the shock of discovering Daniel Brooks, the son he never knew existed. He had already faced the pain of realizing that decades had passed without him being part of Daniel's life. But he also knew there was another person carrying a different kind of pain: Jason Carter. For Jason, this was not just about a DNA test. It was about his entire understanding of who he was and where he came from. For his whole life, Jason had believed that Shaq was his father, not because of a name, not because of a public image, and not because of what other people thought. Shaq was his father because he was the person who showed up when life was difficult, the person who gave advice when Jason needed direction, and the person who stood beside him through the moments that shaped him. But now, that foundation had been shaken. Jason found himself looking back at his childhood differently. The memories were still there, but his mind kept returning to the same painful question. If Shaq was not his biological father, did that mean the relationship they built was somehow less real? He remembered the years they spent together. He remembered the basketball courts where Shaq taught him lessons that went beyond the game. He remembered the conversations after difficult moments, the encouragement after failures, and the times when Shaq reminded him that mistakes did not define who he was. But after the DNA results, Jason felt lost. He was not angry because he stopped loving Shaq. He was hurt because he was afraid of losing the person he had always considered his father. For days, Jason struggled with emotions he could not explain. He wondered if his childhood had been built on something that was not completely true. He wondered if the memories he treasured would now feel different because of a scientific result. The hardest part was that Jason knew two things could exist at the same time. The DNA result was real, but so was the love. And trying to understand both of those truths was the battle he was facing. Eventually, Jason and Shaq sat down together to have the conversation they both knew they could not avoid. There was no audience, no cameras, and no outside opinions. It was simply a father and a son trying to understand what happened to their family. The room was quiet at first. Shaq looked at Jason and could see the pain in his eyes. He knew his son was not searching for an explanation about genetics. Jason was searching for reassurance. He needed to know that the relationship he had trusted his entire life was still there. After a long silence, Jason finally opened up about what he had been feeling. "I don't know how I'm supposed to look at everything now," Jason admitted. "I keep thinking about all those memories we shared, and I don't know if I should feel different about them." Hearing those words was painful for Shaq because he understood exactly what Jason was afraid of. Jason was not questioning whether Shaq cared about him. He was questioning whether he still had a place in Shaq's heart. Shaq took a moment before responding because he wanted Jason to understand something that could never be explained by a test result. "Jason, nothing about this changes what we built together," Shaq said. "The years we spent together were real. The moments we shared were real. The love I have for you was never based on a DNA test." Those words did not erase the confusion Jason felt, but they gave him something he desperately needed: the reminder that he had not lost his father. Shaq continued, knowing that Jason needed to hear the truth from him. "I was there when you needed someone. I watched you grow. I helped you through hard times. I celebrated your victories. Those things happened because you are my son, and nobody can take those memories away from us." Jason looked down as he tried to process everything, For the first time since learning the truth, he began to understand that the DNA result answered one question, but it could not answer every question. It could explain biology, but it could not explain love. It could explain where someone came from, but it could not explain who stayed. Shaq knew he could not remove Jason's pain completely. He knew there would be moments when Jason still struggled with the reality of everything that happened, but he also knew that his responsibility as a father had not changed. If anything, it mattered more now, because being a father was not only about being there during easy moments, it was about staying when life became complicated. Jason eventually began to understand that the man who raised him was still the same man. The memories were still his. The lessons were still his. The love he received was still real. A piece of paper could reveal information about the past, but it could not erase a lifetime of connection. Slowly, Jason stopped seeing the DNA test as something that took his father away and started seeing it as something that revealed a more complicated truth about family. He realized that fatherhood was not created only through blood. It was created through sacrifice, through patience, through countless moments when someone chose to be there. And Shaq had chosen him every single day. The situation was painful, and the road ahead would not be easy. There were still questions that needed answers, and emotions that needed time to heal. But the most important thing remained unchanged. Jason was still the son who grew up with Shaq's guidance. Shaq was still the father who had been there. And their relationship was not defined by the DNA they shared. It was defined by the love they built. While Jason struggled to understand his identity after the DNA results, Ethan Carter faced a different kind of pain. He was not only trying to understand the truth about his biological connection to Shaq, he was trying to understand what that truth meant for the relationship they had built over his entire life. For Ethan, Shaq had always been more than just a father. He was the person he looked up to, the person whose opinion mattered most, and the person who made him feel like he could overcome anything. Growing up, Ethan never questioned whether Shaq would be there for him. His father's presence had always felt like something permanent, something he could depend on no matter what happened. But after the DNA results changed everything, Ethan suddenly found himself questioning something he had never questioned before. Where did he belong? The truth created a fear that Ethan struggled to admit. He was not only worried about the past, he was worried about the future. He wondered if things would change now that Shaq had discovered Daniel, a biological son who had been missing from his life for decades. Ethan knew that Shaq loved Daniel. He understood that Daniel had lost many years with his father and deserved the chance to build a relationship with him. But deep inside, Ethan carried a fear that was difficult to ignore. Would there still be room for him? Would Shaq look at him differently now? Would the years they spent together mean less because of what the DNA test revealed? Those questions stayed in Ethan's mind. He remembered the moments that made him feel like Shaq was truly his father. He remembered the advice, the encouragement, and the times when Shaq pushed him to believe in himself. He remembered the moments when life felt difficult, and his father was the person who helped him find confidence again. Those memories were the reason the situation hurt so much. Ethan was not afraid of losing a last name. He was afraid of losing a relationship. The hardest part was that Ethan knew Shaq had never treated him differently. He knew the love was there, but emotions are not always controlled by logic. Sometimes, even when someone knows they are loved, they still need to hear it again when life changes. And Ethan needed that reassurance. When Ethan finally sat down with Shaq, he carried all the feelings he had been holding inside. The conversation was not easy, because both of them understood that the DNA results had affected everyone differently. Shaq looked at Ethan and immediately saw the uncertainty in his eyes. He recognized that his son was carrying a fear he should never have had to carry. After a quiet moment, Ethan finally expressed what had been hurting him. "I need to know something," Ethan said. "After everything that happened, do I still matter the same way to you?" The question broke Shaq's heart, because in that moment, Shaq realized Ethan was not asking about biology. He was asking if he was still loved. He was asking if the years they shared still counted. He was asking if the father he trusted was still his father. Shaq knew there was only one answer. He looked at Ethan and reminded him that nothing about the DNA results could erase the life they had lived together. "Ethan, you have never been just a DNA result to me," Shaq told him. "You are my son, because of everything we have been through, because of every moment we shared, because of every time I watched you grow into the person you are today." Shaq wanted Ethan to understand something important. A father's love was not something that could suddenly disappear because of new information. Love was not created by a test. It was created through years of showing up, caring, and being there when someone needed you. He reminded Ethan of all the moments they shared, the conversations, the challenges, the victories, and the times when they supported each other through life. Those memories belonged to them. Nobody could take them away. Ethan listened carefully, because deep inside, he knew those words were true. The DNA test had changed the way he looked at certain facts, but it had not changed the way Shaq treated him throughout his life. The man in front of him was still the same father who had been there, the same person who encouraged him, the same person who believed in him. Slowly, Ethan began to understand that love was not something that could be replaced. A new relationship with Daniel did not mean losing the relationship he already had with Shaq. A bigger family did not mean less love for the people who had always been there. There was room for both. There was room for the truth about the past and the love that had existed all along. Shaq also realized that this moment was not just about comforting Ethan. It was about showing him through actions that their relationship would continue. He knew words mattered, but being present mattered even more. So he made a choice. He would continue being the father Ethan had always known. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. The DNA test had revealed complicated truths, but it could not erase years of memories. It could not erase the bond created through thousands of moments between a father and son. Ethan's journey was not about accepting that Shaq was no longer his father. It was about understanding that fatherhood had never been about biology alone. It was about the person who stayed, the person who guided you, the person who loved you, even when life became complicated. And for Ethan, that person had always been Shaq. The truth had tested their relationship, but it also gave them the chance to choose each other again. Not because they had to, but because after everything they had been through, they still wanted to. Among everyone affected by the DNA results, Emily Carter carried a different kind of pain. Jason was struggling with his identity. Ethan was afraid of losing his place in the family. Shaq was trying to accept a truth that changed everything he believed about his past. But Emily was carrying something that nobody else expected. She blamed herself. To Emily, everything started with a simple gift. She was the one who bought the DNA test. She was the one who thought it would be a fun experience between a father and daughter. She was the one who placed that small package in Shaq's hands, believing it would create another happy memory they could share. But now, that same gift had uncovered secrets that caused pain throughout the family. Emily began wondering if she had opened a door that should have remained closed. She watched the people she loved struggle with emotions they never expected to face. She saw Shaq carrying the weight of discovering a son he never knew existed. She saw Jason questioning parts of his childhood. She saw Ethan searching for reassurance that he was still loved. And deep inside, Emily felt responsible. She thought about that day when she handed the gift to her father. She remembered how happy she was, how excited she felt about learning more about their family history. At that time, it seemed like such a harmless idea. She never imagined that something meant to bring them closer would uncover decades of hidden pain. The guilt slowly began to affect her. Emily started feeling like she was the reason her family was hurting. She wondered if things would have been easier if she had never bought the test. She wondered if everyone would still be living peacefully if she had simply chosen a different gift. But Shaq noticed the change in his daughter. He knew Emily was carrying a burden that did not belong to her. He knew she was looking at the situation as if she had caused the pain, when in reality, she had only revealed something that had already existed. One day, Shaq sat down with Emily and talked to her about what had happened. He could see the sadness in her face. He could see that she was blaming herself for something she never intended to create. Emily finally opened up about what she had been feeling. "I keep thinking about that day," Emily admitted. "I thought I was giving you something special. I never thought it would change everything." Hearing those words was difficult for Shaq because he realized his daughter had been silently suffering. He knew Emily needed to understand something important. The DNA test did not destroy their family. The secrets did. Shaq gently reminded her that the truth did not create the problems they were facing. The truth only revealed things that had been hidden for years. The pain came from the choices and circumstances of the past, not from Emily trying to do something kind for her father. "Emily, you gave me a gift because you love me," Shaq told her. "You wanted us to share a moment together. You didn't break this family. You gave us a chance to understand it better." Those words helped Emily see the situation differently. For so long, she had focused on the pain the test revealed, but she had not considered what else it brought. The truth brought Daniel into their lives. Without that test, Shaq might have never known about the son who had been missing from his story for decades. Without that test, Daniel might have spent his entire life never knowing who his father was. The same truth that caused pain also created a chance for healing. Emily slowly began to understand that sometimes love requires courage. Sometimes caring about a family means being willing to face difficult things instead of pretending they do not exist. And that was exactly what she had done. She had unknowingly become the person who opened the door to healing. As the family struggled to adjust to their new reality, Emily became the connection between everyone. She was the person who understood each person's pain and reminded them that they were still a family. She helped Jason see that Daniel was not someone taking his place. She helped Ethan understand that love was not something that had to be divided. She helped Shaq remember that even though his family story had changed, the love within it had not disappeared. Emily became the bridge between the past and the future. The same gift that she once believed had caused destruction had actually created an opportunity for everyone to finally face the truth and begin healing. She learned that families are not defined by avoiding difficult moments. They are defined by how they face those moments together. Looking back, Emily realized that she had not broken her family. She had helped reveal what was hidden so they could finally rebuild something stronger. The DNA test changed everything, but it was love that kept everyone together. And Emily, the daughter who thought she had caused the pain, became the person who helped her family find their way back to each other. After meeting Daniel Brooks for the first time, Shaq believed the hardest part was finally behind him. For weeks he had imagined that moment, the moment when he would finally stand face to face with the son he never knew existed. He imagined the silence, the emotions, and the uncertainty of looking into the eyes of someone who carried his blood, but had lived an entire lifetime without him. But after that first meeting ended, Shaq realized something important. Finding Daniel was not the hardest part. Understanding the pain Daniel carried was. The first meeting gave them a beginning. They talked about their lives, their interests, and the strange similarities that connected them despite spending decades apart. Shaq noticed Daniel's personality, his kindness, and the way he treated people. He saw qualities that made him proud, but he also noticed something else. Behind Daniel's calm expression was a lifetime of unanswered questions. Shaq had spent weeks thinking about his own pain. He thought about the years he lost, the childhood moments he never witnessed, and the memories he would never be able to recover. But he slowly realized that Daniel had lost something too. Not just a father, a sense of certainty. One evening, Shaq and Daniel sat together in a quiet room. There were no cameras, no public attention, no expectations. Just two people trying to understand a relationship that should have started decades earlier. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel looked down and took a deep breath. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. Shaq looked at him carefully. "Of course. Anything." Daniel hesitated. "When you found out about me, What was the first thing you felt? The question surprised Shaq. He expected anger. He expected questions about the past. But he did not expect this. Shaq looked away for a moment, trying to find the right words. Honestly, Shaq said quietly, pain. Daniel nodded slowly. Because you missed my life? Shaq swallowed hard. Yes, because I missed your life. I missed things I can never get back. Daniel looked at him. Do you know what I thought about most when I was younger? Shaq remained silent, giving him space. I used to wonder if my father ever thought about me. Those words hit Shaq harder than any accusation could have. Daniel continued. I didn't know your name. I didn't know where you were. I didn't know if you even knew I existed. But sometimes when something important happened in my life, I would think, would he be proud of me? Shaq lowered his head. For a man who had faced millions of people in arenas around the world, this moment felt heavier than anything he had ever experienced. Daniel, Shaq said softly, if I had known you existed, I would have been there. Daniel looked at him. But you weren't. The words were painful, because they were true. Shaq did not try to defend himself. He did not make excuses. I know, Shaq replied. And that's the part that hurts me the most. I can't change that. Daniel looked away, fighting back emotions he had carried for years. Do you know how strange it feels? Daniel asked. To meet your father when you're already an adult? To see someone who should have been there your whole life, but he's basically a stranger? Shaq felt the weight of those words. I understand why you feel that way. No, I don't think anyone can understand it unless they've lived it. Shaq nodded. You're right. That answer surprised Daniel, because he expected Shaq to explain. He expected him to defend himself. Instead, Shaq accepted the pain. I can't tell you how it felt to grow up without me, Shaq said, because I wasn't the one who lived that life. You were. Daniel looked at him. But I want you to know something. If I could go back, I would change everything. I would be there for your first steps. I would be there for your first day of school. I would be there when you needed someone to tell you that you were good enough. Daniel's eyes became emotional. But you can't go back. No, Shaq answered. I can't. A long silence filled the room. Then Shaq continued. But I can be here now. Daniel looked at him. I don't need you to pretend the past didn't happen. I don't need you to tell me everything is okay. It isn't okay. We lost a lot. Shaq nodded. You're right. But maybe, Daniel paused, maybe we don't have to lose everything. Those words stayed with Shaq, because for the first time, he realized Daniel was not closing the door. He was opening one, a different kind of relationship, not one built on the years they missed, but one built on the years they still had. Shaq reached out and placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. I need you to know something, Shaq said. You were never forgotten. Daniel looked at him. I didn't know you. Shaq took a breath. But if I had known, you would have mattered. You would have always mattered. For years, Daniel had carried the pain of feeling like a missing piece in someone else's story. But in that moment, he finally understood something. He was not a mistake. He was not a forgotten child. He was someone whose story had taken a long time to reach the truth. The DNA test had revealed a biological connection, but this conversation created something more important, a beginning. Shaq knew he could never become the father Daniel needed during his childhood, but he could become the father Daniel deserved from that moment forward. And Daniel slowly began to understand that sometimes healing does not come from recovering lost years. Sometimes healing comes from finally having someone say the words you waited your whole life to hear. I am here now. After the emotional conversations between Shaq and Daniel, both of them understood that their journey could not stop with just the relationship between father and son. Daniel had discovered the father he never knew existed, but he was also discovering something else, a family he never expected to have. For decades, Daniel had lived with the idea that his family story was incomplete. He knew there was a missing piece somewhere, but he never imagined that finding that piece would introduce him to three people who would completely change the way he understood family. Shaq knew that introducing Daniel to Jason, Ethan, and Emily would be one of the most important moments in this entire journey. He understood that this meeting would not be simple. Daniel was not just meeting new people. He was meeting the children who had grown up with the father he never had. And Jason, Ethan, and Emily were not just meeting a new person. They were meeting the brother they never knew existed. Before the meeting, Shaq spoke privately with each of them. He wanted them to understand that nobody was being replaced. He knew the biggest fear inside the family was not anger. It was insecurity. Everyone was wondering the same thing in different ways. Would there still be enough love? Would this new relationship change everything they had built? Would Daniel's arrival mean someone else would lose their place? Shaq looked at his children and reminded them that love was not something that became smaller when more people entered your life. Family is not a competition, Shaq told them. Daniel coming into our lives does not take anything away from any of you. It only means our story is bigger than we thought. Those words stayed with them as they prepared for the meeting. When Daniel finally arrived, the atmosphere was filled with emotions nobody could easily explain. Everyone knew they were about to experience a moment that would change their family forever, but nobody knew exactly how to act. They were connected by blood, but they were also strangers. Jason was the first person Daniel greeted. For a few seconds, both men simply looked at each other. They knew they shared the same father, but they also knew their lives had been completely different. Jason had grown up calling Shaq his father. He had memories of childhood, conversations, and years of guidance. Daniel had spent those same years wondering about the father he never knew. The difference between their experiences created an uncomfortable silence. Finally, Jason smiled slightly and reached out his hand. "Honestly, I don't really know what I'm supposed to say right now," Jason admitted. Daniel nodded. "I feel the same way." Jason looked at him. "I know this situation is strange, for me, for you, for everyone." Daniel gave a small smile. "Yeah, I think strange is probably the only word that fits." That simple moment broke some of the tension between them. They both realized they did not need to pretend everything felt normal. It didn't. This was a situation nobody could have prepared for. Ethan experienced similar emotions. He wanted Daniel to feel welcomed, but he also carried his own fears. After everything he had learned about DNA and family, Ethan understood better than anyone that relationships could feel uncertain. He knew what it was like to wonder if a connection could disappear because of a scientific result. When he spoke with Daniel, he was honest. "I want you to know something," Ethan said. "I know you missed a lot of years with Dad. I know you deserve the chance to have a relationship with him. I just hope you understand that I never want this to feel like someone is losing something." Daniel looked at him carefully. "I don't want that either." Ethan nodded. "Because the truth is, you didn't take anything from me." Those words meant more to Daniel than Ethan realized. For years, Daniel had imagined meeting Shaq and wondered if he would feel like an outsider. He wondered if he would be seen as someone arriving too late, someone who belonged to the past instead of the present. But standing there with Jason and Ethan, Daniel slowly began to understand something important. He was not there to take someone's place. He was there because he finally had a place of his own. Emily's meeting with Daniel carried a different emotion. She was the person who had unknowingly started this entire journey. Without her DNA test gift, none of them would be standing together in that room. She had spent weeks feeling guilty, believing she had opened a door that caused pain. But when she saw Daniel, those feelings began to change. She looked at him and realized that behind all the complicated emotions was a person who had spent decades not knowing his own family history. "You're the reason everything changed," Emily said softly. Daniel looked surprised. "I hope that's not a bad thing." Emily immediately shook her head. "No, I used to think I caused all this pain. But now I realize something. Maybe the truth was painful because it needed to come out." Daniel smiled. "I think your gift changed my entire life." Emily became emotional. "It changed all of ours." As the day continued, the awkwardness slowly began to disappear. They started talking about simple things, their childhood memories, their interests, their personalities, the small details that made them who they were. And something unexpected happened. They began finding connections. Daniel laughed when he realized he had some of the same habits as Jason and Ethan. Emily noticed similarities between Daniel and Shaq that she had never seen before. They discovered that while they had grown up in different worlds, there were pieces of the same family hidden inside each of them. The situation was still complicated. Nobody pretended that everything was suddenly perfect. There were still questions. There were still painful memories. There were still years that could never be recovered. But they began to understand that this was not about fixing the past. It was about accepting the truth and choosing what came next. Later that evening, Shaq watched his children sitting together and realized something he never expected. For months, he had been afraid that the DNA results would destroy his family. He feared that the truth would divide the people he loved. But instead, the truth had created a new opportunity. Daniel was not replacing Jason, Ethan, or Emily. Jason, Ethan, and Emily were not obstacles between Shaq and Daniel. They were all part of the same story. Shaq looked around the room and quietly said, "For a long time, I thought family was about the people I knew. But maybe family is also about the people you find." Everyone became silent because they understood what he meant. Their family story had changed, but it had not ended. It had simply become bigger. And for Daniel, meeting his new family was not about finding the people he had lost. It was about discovering the people he never knew he had. Months had passed since Daniel Brooks became part of Shaq's life, and the family had slowly learned how to live with a truth that once seemed impossible to accept. The DNA test that began as a simple birthday gift from Emily had changed everything. It had brought Daniel into their lives, but it had also created wounds that everyone had to learn how to heal. For Shaq, the journey was about accepting the pain of lost years while building a relationship with a son he never knew existed. For Daniel, it was about finally discovering where he came from and finding a father who had spent decades not knowing he was out there. For Jason and Ethan, it was about facing the terrifying possibility that the man who raised them might not be connected to them by blood. But even though the family had moved forward, the original DNA results remained a quiet reminder of the day everything changed. Jason and Ethan had learned to accept the truth they were given. They understood that Shaq was still their father because of every moment they shared together, every lesson he taught them, and every time he showed up when they needed him. They no longer questioned whether their relationship was real, because they knew love could not be measured by a laboratory result. Still, accepting the truth did not mean forgetting the pain. There were moments when Jason looked at old pictures from his childhood and felt a strange mixture of gratitude and sadness. He knew Shaq was his father in every way that mattered, but a small part of him still wondered why life had created such a complicated story. Ethan carried similar emotions. He had accepted that family was bigger than biology, but he remembered the fear he felt when he first thought he had lost the connection he believed existed. Shaq saw those moments, even when his sons tried to hide them. A father notices the things his children do not say. He knew Jason and Ethan were stronger because of what they had experienced, but he also knew that a piece of uncertainty still remained inside them. Deep down, Shaq wished he could take away the confusion they had gone through. Then, several months after the original DNA results, an unexpected message arrived. It was a normal morning. Shaq was sitting quietly, going through his emails, expecting nothing unusual. His life had finally begun to settle into a new rhythm. Daniel was no longer just a name from a DNA report. He was becoming part of the family. They were creating new memories together and slowly building something that had been missing for decades. That was why Shaq almost ignored the email when he saw it. The message came from the DNA company. The subject immediately caught his attention. Important update regarding your DNA results. For a moment, Shaq froze. He remembered the last time he received a message like this. He remembered opening the first report and seeing Daniel Brooks's name appear on the screen. He remembered the shock, the confusion, and the pain that followed. That single result had changed the way he looked at his entire life. Now he was looking at another message from the same company. A feeling he could not explain returned. Fear. Shaq opened the email slowly. As he read the first few lines, his expression changed. The company explained that after conducting a detailed review of their testing process, they discovered an issue that required additional verification. Certain DNA comparisons from the original report had been flagged for further analysis. Shaq read the message again, trying to understand what it meant. There was a possibility that the original results were not accurate. For a long time, he simply stared at the screen, because suddenly, everything he thought he understood was uncertain again. He immediately contacted the company and requested a complete reanalysis. He did not want assumptions. He did not want possibilities. He wanted the truth. When the new results were ready, Shaq made a decision. He would not open them alone. He asked Jason and Ethan to be there with him, because they had already gone through one life-changing moment together. Whatever the answer was, he wanted them to face it as a family. The room was quiet as Shaq opened the new report. Jason and Ethan sat beside him, both trying to prepare themselves for whatever came next. They had already learned that a few words on a screen could change everything. Shaq looked at the results. For several seconds, he said nothing. Jason noticed his father's expression and became nervous. "Dad, what does it say?" Shaq looked up slowly. His eyes were filled with emotion. Then he said something that none of them expected. "The first result was wrong." The room became silent. Ethan looked confused. "What do you mean wrong?" Shaq took a deep breath, because even saying the words felt impossible. "I mean, you were never not my sons." Jason stared at him. Shaq continued, his voice breaking with emotion. "The new test confirmed it. Both of you are my biological children." For a moment, nobody moved. The truth they had been waiting for was finally in front of them, but it was almost too overwhelming to process. Jason looked down, trying to control his emotions. "So all this time?" Shaq nodded. "All this time, you were my sons, the way I always knew you were." Jason wiped his eyes. "I spent months trying to accept that maybe the connection we had wasn't what I thought it was." Shaq moved closer to him. "Jason, listen to me. Nothing about our relationship was ever a mistake. Even if the result had been true, nothing would have changed how I felt about you." Jason looked at his father. "But now I know something else too." Shaq waited. "I know that I never actually lost you." Those words broke through the emotional wall Shaq had built. He hugged his son. "You never lost me, not for 1 second." Ethan was also struggling with the news. For months, he'd convinced himself that DNA did not matter, because the love between him and Shaq was stronger than any test. He had learned to accept that their relationship was built on choice and commitment. Now he discovered something he never expected. He had both, the love and the blood connection. Ethan looked at Shaq and smiled through his tears. "I guess I spent all this time worrying about losing something that was never gone." Shaq nodded. "Sometimes life makes us afraid of losing things we already have." When Emily heard the news, after the second DNA result changed everything once again, the Carter family entered a new chapter of their lives. For months, they had been trying to understand a reality that constantly shifted beneath their feet. First, they believed Daniel was the missing piece of Shaq's story. Then they believed Jason and Ethan had lost their biological connection to him. They had learned to accept a painful truth, only to discover that truth had been incomplete. Now, after all the confusion, they finally had the answers they had been searching for. But Shaq quickly realized something important. Knowing the truth did not automatically heal every wound. The DNA results had corrected a mistake, but the emotions created by that mistake were still real. Jason and Ethan had spent months questioning their identity. Daniel had spent a lifetime wondering where he belonged. Emily had carried the guilt of believing her gift had caused pain. Even Shaq, despite being the person everyone looked to for strength, was still processing the emotional journey that had changed his entire understanding of family. The family was together now, but they were still learning how to move forward. For Shaq, the biggest challenge was making sure nobody felt like they had to compete for his love. He knew that the arrival of Daniel had created fears that nobody wanted to admit. Jason and Ethan had once worried that Daniel's presence would change their relationship with their father. Daniel had worried that he would always feel like an outsider because he arrived decades too late. Shaq understood those fears because he had felt something similar himself. He had spent his life believing that he knew exactly what his family looked like. Then, in a single moment, everything changed. He discovered a son he never knew existed and faced the possibility of losing the biological connection with two sons he had raised. But now he understood something deeper. Family was not about protecting an old picture of what life was supposed to be. Family was about accepting the truth and choosing each other despite everything. One evening, Shaq gathered everyone together. It was not a formal meeting. There were no cameras, no outside attention, and no reason for anyone to pretend they were stronger than they felt. It was simply a father sitting with his children, trying to make sure everyone understood what mattered most. Shaq looked around the room before speaking. "I know the last few months have been difficult," he said. "I know everyone has had questions. I know everyone has had moments where they wondered what this all means." Nobody interrupted, because everyone knew exactly what he was talking about. Shaq continued, "But I want all of you to understand something. None of you are here because of a test result. None of you have a place in my life because of biology alone." He looked at Jason and Ethan. "You two are my sons because I watched you grow. I was there when you needed me. I saw the people you became." Then he looked at Daniel. "And you are my son, because even though I missed years with you, the moment I learned about you, I knew there was a part of my heart that had been missing." Daniel lowered his eyes, trying to hide his emotions. Shaq looked at Emily. "And you are the person who gave me the truth. A truth that hurt at first, but a truth that gave us a chance to become stronger." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Jason finally broke the silence. "I think the hardest part for me was feeling like everything had changed," Jason admitted. "When I found out the first result, I started questioning memories that I knew were real. I started wondering if I was looking at my own life differently." Shaq nodded. "I know." Jason looked at Daniel. "But then I realized something. Daniel didn't take anything from me." Daniel looked surprised. Jason continued, "He lost years with Dad too. He wasn't the reason any of this happened." Those words meant a lot to Daniel because, deep inside, he had always feared being seen as the person who changed the family. "I was afraid of meeting all of you," Daniel admitted. "I thought maybe you would see me as someone who came into your lives and complicated everything." Ethan shook his head. "Honestly, we were afraid too." Daniel looked at him. Ethan smiled slightly. "But not because of you. We were afraid because we didn't know what would happen next." That honesty created something powerful between them. For the first time, they were no longer trying to act like everything was easy. They were admitting that the situation was complicated. They were acknowledging that building a new family dynamic would take time. And that was okay. Because real families were not created by pretending problems did not exist. They were created by facing those problems together. Over the following months, small moments began changing everything. Daniel started spending more time with Jason and Ethan. At first, their conversations felt careful, almost like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. They knew they shared a father, but they were still learning how to become brothers. Slowly, the distance began to disappear. They started sharing stories about their childhoods. Jason and Ethan told Daniel about moments with Shaq that he had missed. Daniel shared stories from his own life that Shaq and the family had never heard before. Instead of focusing on what they lost, they started discovering what they could build. One day, Daniel looked at Jason and Ethan and laughed. "It is still strange saying this." Jason smiled. "What?" "That I have brothers." Ethan laughed. "Trust me, having brothers is not always as exciting as you think." Everyone laughed. It was a simple moment, but for Shaq, it meant everything. Because months earlier, he never imagined seeing his children sitting together like that. He once feared the truth would divide them. Instead, the truth had created a bigger family. Emily noticed the change too. The guilt she carried for so long slowly disappeared. She realized that her father was right from the beginning. The DNA test did not break their family. It revealed the parts of their story they needed to understand. She looked at Shaq one day and said, "I used to think I was the reason everything became complicated." Shaq smiled. "You were the reason we finally stopped hiding from the truth." Emily nodded. "And now?" Shaq looked at his children. "Now I think we were given another chance." That was the lesson the family slowly learned. They could not change the years that had passed. They could not rewrite the moments Daniel missed or erase the confusion Jason and Ethan experienced. They could not pretend the journey had been easy. But they could choose what happened next. They could choose forgiveness. They could choose understanding. They could choose love. And that choice became the foundation of their new family. The DNA test had started this journey by revealing secrets, but love was what carried them through it. Shaq once believed the greatest victories in life came from championships, achievements, and moments celebrated by millions of people. Now he understood something different. The greatest victories were often quiet. They happened in living rooms. They happened in honest conversations. They happened when people chose to stay together even after discovering truths that could have pulled them apart. And as Shaq looked at his children, Daniel, Jason, Ethan, and Emily, he realized his family was no longer the family he thought he had. It was something even greater. It was a family that knew the truth, a family that survived the truth, and a family that chose each other anyway. For the first time in many months, Shaq felt like his family had finally found peace. The chaos created by the DNA test had slowly transformed into something he never expected. What began as a discovery filled with pain, confusion, and fear had become a journey of healing. Daniel was no longer a stranger. Jason and Ethan no longer questioned their place in the family. Emily no longer carried the guilt of believing she had caused the pain. They had finally reached a moment where they could breathe. But life had a way of reminding people that some stories were not finished yet. For Daniel, becoming part of Shaq's family answered one of the biggest questions he had carried throughout his life. He finally knew where he came from. He finally knew who his biological father was. He finally had people who wanted him in their lives. But there was still a small part of Daniel's past that remained unexplained. The years before he discovered Shaq, the secrets surrounding his birth, and the questions his mother had never fully answered. Daniel had always believed that finding Shaq would be the final missing piece of his identity. He never imagined that discovering one truth would lead him to another mystery. The revelation came unexpectedly. Daniel was going through old family documents that belonged to his mother. He was not searching for anything specific. He simply wanted to understand more about his early life and the years before he knew the truth about his father. Among the old papers, he discovered something that immediately caught his attention: a hospital document from the year he was born. At first, Daniel thought it was just another piece of his childhood history, but as he read through the information, he noticed something unusual. There was a reference to another child, a baby born on the same day, with the same mother. Daniel stared at the document, confused. He read the information again, hoping he had misunderstood. But the name was there: Andrew Brooks. For several minutes, Daniel could not move. Another child, another person connected to his story, a person he had never heard about. Daniel immediately contacted Shaq and asked to meet. When they sat together, Shaq could tell something was different. Daniel had the same expression he had seen months earlier when the first DNA results changed everything. "What happened?" Shaq asked. Daniel placed the document on the table. "I found something about my past." Shaq looked at the paper. Daniel took a deep breath. "Apparently, I wasn't born alone." Shaq looked confused. "What do you mean?" Daniel pointed to the document. "There was another baby, a brother." The room became silent. Shaq looked at Daniel carefully. "A brother?" Daniel nodded. "His name is Andrew Brooks." For a moment, neither of them spoke. After everything they had already experienced, the idea that another hidden family connection existed seemed almost impossible. Shaq leaned back, trying to process the information. "Daniel, did you know about him before?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I had no idea." The emotion in Daniel's voice was difficult to hide. For years, he had wondered why certain parts of his life felt incomplete. He thought the missing piece was his father. Now he was discovering there might have been someone else missing too. A twin brother. Someone who shared the same beginning. Someone who had lived an entirely different life. Daniel looked at Shaq. "I spent my whole life thinking I was searching for one person. First, I was searching for my father. Now I find out I might have been searching for my brother too." Shaq understood that feeling, because he knew what it meant to discover someone important had been missing from your life. He placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "We're going to find him." Daniel looked at him. "You really believe we can?" Shaq nodded. "I spent decades not knowing you existed. Then one day we found each other. I don't think we should stop looking now." Those words gave Daniel hope, but they also brought fear, because finding Andrew meant facing another unknown. Where had he been all these years? Why had they been separated? Who knew the truth? And most importantly, would Andrew even want to be found? The family soon became involved in the search. Jason, Ethan, and Emily all wanted to help Daniel find the missing piece of his story. They understood his emotions because they had all experienced their own unexpected discoveries. Emily especially felt connected to Daniel's journey. She remembered how one small DNA test had changed everything. Now another discovery had opened another door. "This family has a way of finding secrets," Emily said with a small smile. Daniel laughed. "I think I'm starting to believe that." But beneath the humor was a deeper understanding. They were no longer searching because they wanted answers alone. They were searching because another person was out there, a person who might have spent a lifetime wondering about the same things Daniel wondered about. Someone who might have looked at his own life and felt that something was missing. As the family began gathering information about Andrew, they discovered small details that only created more questions. There were records that suggested Andrew had been raised somewhere else. There were unanswered questions about why the brothers had been separated and why Daniel had never been told. Every new piece of information brought them closer, but it also reminded them that some truths were hidden for reasons nobody fully understood. One night, Daniel sat with Shaq and admitted his fears. "What if he doesn't want to meet me?" Shaq looked at him. "Why would you think that?" "Because I know what it feels like to find out someone important was missing from your life. Maybe he doesn't want to open that door." Shaq nodded. "Daniel, you spent your whole life without knowing about him, but you still wanted answers. Maybe he has been waiting for answers too." Daniel looked at his father. "You really think family can find its way back?" Shaq smiled. "I know it can." Because Shaq had experienced it himself. He had found Daniel after decades apart. He had rebuilt relationships after painful truths. He had learned that time could create distance, but it did not always destroy connection. Now another search was beginning. Another person was missing. Another chapter of their family story was waiting to be discovered. The DNA test had started this journey by revealing a hidden son. But Daniel was beginning to realize something even bigger. Sometimes, finding your family is not about discovering who you lost. It is about discovering who was waiting to be found all along. And somewhere in the world, Andrew Brooks was living a life completely separate from his brother, a life that was about to change forever. After discovering the existence of Andrew Brooks, Daniel felt like he was standing at the beginning of another impossible journey. Only a short time earlier, he had spent his entire life believing that one important piece of his identity was missing. He had searched for the truth about his father and eventually found Shaq. He believed that moment would finally complete the story of his life. But then he discovered there was another missing chapter. A brother. Someone who had shared the same beginning but lived an entirely different story. The search for Andrew was not easy. Every piece of information created more questions than answers. The family followed old records, contacted people connected to Daniel's early years, and tried to understand how two brothers born at the same time could grow up in completely different worlds without knowing about each other. For Daniel, the search became emotional in a way he never expected. Finding Shaq had answered a question he carried for decades, but finding Andrew felt different. Shaq was the father he never knew. Andrew was a person who had shared the very beginning of his life. They had entered the world together. They had taken their first breaths on the same day. They had the same mother. Yet somehow, life separated them before they were old enough to understand what they had lost. As the family finally located Andrew, Daniel struggled to prepare himself for the meeting. He had imagined this moment many times, but every version left him with the same uncertainty. What if Andrew did not feel the same way? What if 40 years apart had created a distance that could never be repaired? What if they were connected only by biology and nothing more? Shaq understood those fears because he had experienced something similar when he first met Daniel. He knew that blood could create a connection, but it could not instantly create a relationship. Relationships needed time, trust, and the willingness of two people to open their hearts. Before Daniel met Andrew, Shaq sat with him privately. "You know, when I first found out about you, I was scared too," Shaq said. Daniel looked at him. "You were scared?" Shaq smiled sadly. "Of course. I didn't know if you would accept me. I didn't know if you would be angry. I didn't know if I had missed too much time." Daniel nodded. "I feel the same way." Shaq placed a hand on his shoulder. "But remember something. Sometimes people don't need a perfect beginning. Sometimes they just need someone willing to start." Those words stayed with Daniel as he prepared to meet his brother. When the day finally arrived, everyone understood that this was not just another family gathering. This was a moment 40 years in the making. Daniel and Andrew stood across from each other, both searching for the right words. They were strangers, but they were also something more. They shared a history neither of them remembered. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then Andrew smiled slightly. "I don't really know what to say." Daniel laughed softly. "Neither do I." That small moment broke the tension, because both of them realized they did not need to pretend the situation was normal. It wasn't. It was extraordinary. Andrew looked at Daniel carefully. "It's strange seeing someone who looks like me." Daniel smiled. "I was thinking the same thing." They both laughed, and for the first time, the weight of the moment became a little lighter. As they began talking, they discovered things that surprised them. Small habits, similar expressions, the same way of telling stories, the same reactions to certain situations, things that could not be explained by memories, because they had never shared those memories together. It was as if life had separated them, but pieces of their connection remained. Andrew admitted that for years he felt like something was missing. "I never knew what it was," Andrew said. "I had a good life. I had people who cared about me, but sometimes I felt like there was a part of my story I didn't know." Daniel looked at him. "I know that feeling." Those words connected them immediately, because even though they lived different lives, they carried the same question. Why was something missing? And now they finally had an answer. They were missing each other. The brothers spent hours talking about their lives. They shared stories from childhood, their struggles, their dreams, and the experiences that shaped them into the people they became. They realized that even though they did not grow up together, they both developed similar values. They both cared about family. They both believed in helping others. They both understood the importance of becoming strong, even when life was uncertain. For Daniel, the meeting brought a feeling he never expected: peace. For years, he thought his search was about finding what he had lost, but now he realized it was also about discovering what he still had time to build. When Shaq watched Daniel and Andrew together, he felt an emotion he could barely describe. He had spent months believing his family story was already complicated enough. First, he discovered Daniel. Then he faced the uncertainty with Jason and Ethan. Then he watched his children learn how to become a larger family. Now there was Andrew, another son, another person connected to his story, another reminder that life could reveal secrets even after you thought you knew everything. Shaq approached Andrew carefully. He knew this moment was different. Andrew was not only Daniel's brother. He was another person whose life had been shaped by circumstances beyond his control. "Andrew," Shaq said, "I know this is a lot to take in." Andrew nodded. "It is." Shaq continued, "I don't know what the future looks like yet. I don't know how quickly everything changes. But I want you to know something." Andrew looked at him. "You are welcome here." Those simple words carried enormous meaning, because Shaq understood what it felt like to discover family later in life. He understood the fear of wondering whether there was room for you, and he wanted Andrew to know there was. Daniel watched the moment with emotion. The man he spent decades searching for had found him, and now that same man was opening his heart to someone else who had also been waiting to be found. Later that evening, the entire family sat together. Jason, Ethan, Emily, Daniel, and Andrew were all in the same room, something nobody could have imagined months earlier. Shaq looked around and smiled. For years, he believed he knew exactly what his family looked like. He thought he understood his past. He thought the biggest surprises of his life were behind him. He was wrong. His family was larger than he ever imagined. His story had more chapters than he knew. And the greatest lesson was not about DNA, secrets, or discoveries. It was about connection, because every person sitting in that room represented a different part of his journey. Jason and Ethan represented the years of love and memories he had built. Daniel represented the son he found after decades apart. Andrew represented another missing piece that had finally returned. Emily represented the person who opened the door to the truth. Shaq looked at his children and realized something powerful. Life had taken away years from them, but it had also given them something priceless, a chance to find each other. The family story that began with a simple DNA test had become something much bigger than anyone expected. It was no longer just about discovering secrets from the past. It was about creating a future where nobody had to wonder if they belonged, because now they knew. They belonged together. For the first time in a long time, Shaq felt something he had almost forgotten: peace. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that allow people to heal. As the evening continued, Shaq found himself becoming quieter. He listened more than he spoke. He watched his children interact with each other. He watched Daniel and Andrew laugh together. He watched Jason and Ethan joke around. He watched Emily smile without guilt. And suddenly, his mind returned to the past. He remembered the championships, the pressure, the victories, the moments when the world celebrated him. He remembered holding trophies and hearing people call him a champion. Those moments were special. They would always matter. But sitting at that table, Shaq realized something he had never understood before. A championship ring could prove what someone accomplished, but it could never show what someone loved. A trophy could sit on a shelf, but a family had to be protected every day. Shaq looked around the table and felt a different kind of pride, a deeper kind, because his greatest achievement was not something the world could measure. It was not a record. It was not an award. It was not something written in history books. It was this moment, his children together, his family healed, his past finally understood. After dinner, everyone stayed longer than expected. Nobody wanted the night to end. There were still stories to tell, jokes to share, and memories to create. Shaq stood quietly for a moment, watching them. He thought about everything that had happened, the DNA test, the secrets, the pain, the uncertainty, the search, the reunions. Everything had led to this moment, and he finally understood that life had not taken his family apart. It had revealed how strong their connection truly was. Shaq smiled as he looked at his children. For years, he believed his greatest victories happened on basketball courts. But tonight, he knew the truth. The greatest victory of his life was not winning a championship. It was bringing his family back together, because championships could be celebrated. But family was something you carried in your heart forever. And on this night, Shaq finally felt like he had won the most important game of all. 1 year had passed since the night when Shaq sat at a dinner table surrounded by all of his children and realized that his life had changed forever. A year earlier, he never could have imagined how far their journey would take them. What started with a simple DNA test had become a story about identity, forgiveness, healing, and the meaning of family. The world knew Shaq for many things. They knew him as a basketball legend, a businessman, and a person who achieved success at the highest level. They remembered the championships, the unforgettable moments on the court, and the career that made millions of people admire him. But 1 year later, when Shaq looked back at his life, those achievements felt different. They were still important. They were still moments he was proud of. But they were no longer the things that defined his greatest success, because the most important victory of his life happened away from the spotlight. It happened inside his own family. The wounds from the past had not disappeared completely. Shaq understood that some moments could never be erased. Daniel could never get back the childhood years he spent without his father. Jason and Ethan could never forget the uncertainty they felt when they believed their connection to Shaq was different than they thought. Emily would always remember the fear she carried after believing her gift had changed everything. But those memories no longer controlled them. They had become part of their story, not the end of it. The family learned that healing did not mean pretending the pain never happened. Healing meant accepting what happened and choosing not to let that pain decide the future. Daniel had grown closer to Shaq in a way neither of them expected. The relationship they built was not based on trying to recover the years they lost. They understood that no amount of love could recreate the past, but love could create something new. One day, Daniel sat with Shaq and reflected on everything that had happened. "I used to think finding you would answer every question I had," Daniel said. Shaq smiled. "And did it?" Daniel thought for a moment. "Not exactly." Shaq looked surprised. Daniel continued. "Finding you didn't change the years I missed. It didn't erase the questions I had growing up, but it gave me something I never had before." "What was that?" Shaq asked. Daniel smiled. "Peace." Those words meant more to Shaq than any award he had ever received, because he finally understood that sometimes people do not need someone to fix their past. Sometimes they simply need someone to walk with them into the future. Jason and Ethan also continued to grow in their relationship with Shaq and Daniel. The fear they once carried had been replaced by something stronger. They no longer saw family as something fragile that could disappear because of new information. They understood that family was something people built every day. They joked with Daniel. They shared memories with Andrew. They created new traditions that included everyone. What once felt like a complicated situation slowly became something they could not imagine living without. Andrew also found his place within the family. After spending decades away from Daniel, he discovered that reconnecting with his brother was not about trying to recover everything they missed. It was about appreciating every moment they still had. And for Shaq, watching his children build relationships with each other became one of the greatest joys of his life. He realized that his family was no longer defined by the secrets that brought them together. It was defined by the love that kept them together. Emily often thought about the day she gave Shaq the DNA test. A year later, she no longer saw that moment as the beginning of a crisis. She saw it as the beginning of a transformation. She once believed she had opened a door that should have remained closed. Now she understood that some doors are difficult to open because they lead to places where people finally find the truth. One evening, Emily asked her father something that had been on her mind. "Dad, if you could go back and change everything, would you?" Shaq thought about the question carefully. A year earlier, he might have answered differently. He might have wished he had known about Daniel sooner. He might have wished Jason and Ethan never experienced the confusion of the first DNA result. He might have wished his family never had to go through so much pain. But now he saw things differently. "I would change the pain," Shaq said. "I would never want any of you to hurt." Emily nodded. "But would you change the truth?" Shaq looked around at his family, at Daniel, at Jason, at Ethan, at Andrew, at Emily. Then he smiled. "No." Emily looked surprised. "Why?" "Because the truth brought us here." That answer stayed with her, because Shaq finally understood the lesson life had been trying to teach him. Blood could create a connection. DNA could reveal where someone came from, but love was what created a family. A test result could tell him who shared his genetics, but it could not tell him who would stand beside him during difficult times. It could not measure the years of memories. It could not measure sacrifice. It could not measure forgiveness. Only love could do that. Looking back, Shaq realized that the greatest chapter of his life was not the one written in basketball arenas. It was the one written in quiet moments with the people he loved. It was the moment he chose to find Daniel instead of running from the truth. It was the moment he reminded Jason and Ethan that they were his sons, no matter what a test said. It was the moment Emily learned she did not destroy her family. She helped save it. It was the moment Andrew returned to a family he never knew he had. Those were the moments that created his true legacy. Not championships, not records, not fame. Legacy was the impact a person left on the hearts of others. Years from now, people might remember Shaq for what he accomplished in the world, but his family would remember something more important. They would remember a father who chose love when life became complicated. A father who faced painful truths instead of hiding from them. A father who learned that family is not always the story you are born into. Sometimes, family is the story you choose to build. The DNA test revealed the truth. It uncovered secrets that had been hidden for decades. It changed everything they thought they knew. But in the end, DNA was only the beginning of the story. Love was the force that healed them. Love was the reason they stayed together. Love was the reason they became stronger. And that was the final lesson Shaq carried with him for the rest of his life. Because the greatest victory was never a championship ring. It was never a trophy. It was never standing above the world and hearing millions of people celebrate his name. The greatest victory was sitting at a table surrounded by his family and knowing that after everything they had been through, they were still together. And that was a victory no one could ever take away.